Well, very good afternoon and welcome to today's Crossing Borders broadcast, which is sponsored by Investment, Migration, Education and Training. As usual, I just want to thank all of those that joined us last Wednesday. A recording of that broadcast is available on our YouTube channel, and please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. It's great to see so many of our members and the wider investment migration community each week as we do these broadcasts on Wednesdays at 2:30. I'm hopeful we'll soon be able to meet each other face to face and do some proper catch up. So before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. Please remember you can ask questions and make comments in the GoToWebinar widget, which is on the right of your screen. That's where you'll also find detailed information about today's speakers, how to contact them, and there's also some information about the IMC. There's a short video at the end of today's broadcast about the Investment Migration Council, the Council's Education and Training course. So if you haven't already signed up, hang around to find out more about that course. As ever, to keep you engaged, we will have some polls throughout this afternoon's session. So we're going to run a little test right now and see where you guys are today. So let me launch that. That should be coming up on your screen, and we'll give you about 10 seconds to submit your answers. Okay, I can see it's 85% of the audience attendees have answered, so I'm going to close that off and share the results on your screens and for today's panelists to see. So overwhelmingly a European and African audience today, followed by the Americas, and then in joint places Asia, Middle East and the Caribbean. So of course, that's really interesting and good for us to know. So a little bit about today, we're going to hear from the IMC's regional representative offices on the situation, what's happening on the ground in their respective regions, but we'll also have an update about the global travel and events business and how it's being impacted by COVID-19. So without any further ado, I'll introduce today's panelists. And in Hong Kong, we have Jennifer Lai, who's the managing partner and head of North Asia for Henley and Partners. Good evening, Jennifer. In New York, we have Ron Klasko, who's the managing partner of Klasko Immigration Law Partners. Good morning to you, Ron. In London, we have Nadine Goldfoot, who's a partner for Fragomen, managing partner for Fragomen Immigration LLP in London. Good afternoon to you, Nadine. In the Caribbean, we have Chris Willis, who's the managing director for government advisory and program delivery at Latitude Consultancy. I think it's good morning to you, Chris. And then last but not least, and because we would all like to know when we can start eating airplane foods again, but importantly, how and when we'll be able to meet our business partners and clients face to face. I'm honored and delighted to welcome a global travel and events expert based in the island of Malta, Warren Zahra, who's the managing director for Alpine Sterling Travel and Tourism. So warm welcome, everybody. And to our audience, if you do have any questions, please use the widget on the right of your screen. Any comments, pop those in there and we'll make this as interactive as possible. I'd like to start with you, Nadine, in London. What's the situation in regards to global immigration from a European perspective, and how are ongoing quarantine requirements going to impact the recovery?
Thanks, Bruno. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us. In Europe, we're at varying stages of lockdown being lifted. The provision of lockdown was being determined by every member state of the EU individually, so there hasn't been a consistent approach. And lockdown has varied considerably from highly restrictive, for example, in France, where at some point people required a permission slip to leave the house, to a relatively permissive regime, for example, in the UK, which allowed exercise outside the house once a day, and there wasn't really any policing of that. Most countries in Europe have begun to ease the restrictions, beginning with opening of schools and shops, but to varying degrees. And interestingly, we've seen the introduction of internal migration controls. For example, again in France, where the country is split into red and green zones, red being areas of the country like Paris, which have quite a high infection rate, and so their restrictions have been maintained for longer, green being relatively low rates of infection, and therefore being able to come out of lockdown much more quickly. And in the UK, each of the devolved governments in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland have taken their own approach to lifting lockdown to varied degrees. I would say that for the time being, whilst we are coming out of lockdown, every European country is really monitoring the situation closely and very ready to go straight back in if we see a spike. What's interesting as well is throughout the lockdown period, government agencies across the region have been operating to varying degrees, which is certainly impacting visa processing. On the one extreme, we have Ireland, which has pretty much maintained business as usual, and then the other extreme is Switzerland, where all but a very small amount of visa categories has been entirely shut and will be until the 15th of June. I think now that we're beginning to see countries' domestic lockdowns being lifted to varying degrees, we're hearing noise of consulates beginning to open, hopefully beginning next week, albeit in quite an ad hoc approach. Quite rightly, businesses and individuals are turning now to remobilization. We're assuming some sort of recovery, but although we're seeing recovery beginning at a domestic level, I don't think this necessarily translates internationally just yet, because the recovery is really going to be dependent upon the ease and ability of air travel, which is something we were talking about offline earlier, and very importantly as well, how the quarantine provisions are going to play out. So, most of you would have read in the UK has just now introduced quarantine for anybody entering the country beginning the 8th of June. This is new. Up until now, the UK has not had any border restrictions throughout this process. For the UK, it's going to apply to anybody entering the UK other than those coming from Ireland or the Channel Islands. There will be some exceptions to ensure continuity of supply chains and workflows relation to national security.
Right. Okay. If I can, I want to bring Jennifer Lai in here, because I think that brings certainly some questions that your clients are probably asking you on this point, because there's a mixed bag from what Nadine is saying, and there isn't the assurity that there was pre-COVID-19. What's your clients' criteria in choosing now an alternative residence program? And just very briefly, what's happening in Asia in terms of the lockdown and the quarantine. If you just spend a minute on the current situation and then how your clients are reacting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Good morning, good evening, everybody. Hi. I think for the COVID-19 situation, I think you probably heard the news about Hong Kong. We still have this quarantine for non-Hong Kong residents for they come into Hong Kong. First, they cannot fly into Hong Kong. For any Hong Kong ID card holder, they are welcome to come back home, but then they will have this 14 days quarantine. School actually, the international school actually already back to school from the 20th of May, and then the public school all back on 27th of May. So schooling is open for restaurants in Hong Kong, basically that you can go out now. We go out actually, I would say we're very normal going out. Of course, you're not over 8 people, but then restaurants are open, and then shopping mall, we see more people. So that's a very positive scene. For China, it's the same. That I think that for us to go back to China, or for anyone to fly into China, you still have to under 14 days quarantine. A lot of cities like Beijing, Shanghai, they actually allow, basically, I wouldn't say allow, but then people are traveling now domestically. So, for example, our staff travel to within Shanghai, near the Shanghai region, and then some people are traveling. I know that a lot of law firms now, they travel even from Beijing to Shenzhen, for example, through a plane ride. The airport is open for a lot of cities now in China. So I think those are very positive signs. Even for schools, for example, for Beijing, a lot of schools will open from 1st of June. So I think from that perspective, probably will be open a bit, I would say, faster than some of the countries in Europe where they have a COVID-19 cases. If you look at the number of the cases in Hong Kong right now, I think we have been a single digit since April, mid-April, from 22nd, May of 22nd, we have 0 cases now. So, so it proven, which is the Hong Kong government contained the virus successfully for the past months. Going back to the question about has the client changes the criteria of choosing the residence and citizenship programs after the COVID, or maybe during the COVID-19. So I think for the Q1, Q2, of course, with the European lockdown, people were not going to fly anywhere. So, and then specifically with the programs that required for biometric collections, they were not able to fly. So then, of course, those programs will be affected. And then interestingly, we do see clients now from, I think I would say from this month onwards, we will actually see a lot of clients start to actually moving, having some movements of considering about the options. They have left it in last year, I would say, thinking about how to obtain the alternative options. And interestingly, previously, a lot of clients basically would choose a different citizenship or residency because of the movement, because of the tax planning, succession planning. And then they put into the consideration about the physical residence requirement when they choose the jurisdiction. Interestingly, we see 2 criteria now, which is a lot of specifically a lot of high net worth clients who will start to want to move to places where the government has shown the policies, a very good policy in containing the virus, having a very good health system, and then also they want to choose a jurisdiction where they will, I would say, embrace different race. That means accepting Chinese. Yeah, this is also what we see now with the clients who ask, oh, if I choose this jurisdiction, what was the government has done during the COVID-19? What was the government contained the virus successfully? What kind of healthcare system they have been given to the residents? And is there a bigger Chinese community? Do they really accept Chinese or Asian as a whole? I think those are the new criteria that clients are actually putting into consideration when they choose the options now.
That's great. I want to bring Chris Willis first, and then straight after Ron, because we were having a chat about this a little bit earlier on. But Chris, what's the situation in the Caribbean? You know, we've got 5 islands. 5 islands that have direct citizenship programs. How have they dealt with COVID-19? What have been the containment measures, as Jennifer put it, and how are they looking to continue processing case files, given that they are small countries and perhaps don't have the necessary resources of bigger countries? What's the situation on the ground over there, please, Chris Willis?
Thanks, Bruno, and hello, everybody. Yeah, I mean, the situation there is slightly different because, geographically, they're smaller islands, and they were able to contain it and manage it much easier than, let's say, larger countries, like in the US or in Asia or Europe at the moment. But what's happened is most of the infections that occurred were coming from either passengers coming on a cruise, you know, staying for the day, infecting somebody locally, and then that led to some community spread. So it was more people from outside coming in as opposed to contamination happening within the island. And as I mentioned, you know, they were able to contain it and manage it, but they also shut their borders, you know, which was a key thing. You know, a couple of them are opening up in the beginning of June. Antigua, Barbuda, and also St. Lucia will be opening up June 4th, June 5th to their borders, but they're going to make it extremely restrictive. So, for example, if someone's coming from tourism, they'll have to stay on, you know, within, say, an all-inclusive resort. So they wouldn't have permission to leave the resort. They would stay contained in that space. And, you know, to the level that, you know, staff members would have to, you know, leave their clothing at the resort, shower when they arrive, when they leave, all that type of thing, just to minimize any chance of any further contamination. So from a tourism point of view, obviously the Caribbean islands are highly dependent on this in terms of revenues, and they were, you know, decimated. You know, their high season was wiped out essentially because of the virus. And so there's pressure to bring in, you know, revenues, and the citizenship by investment programs obviously are a source of that. And to the credit of all the units, so, you know, across all 5 islands, they've been able to maintain their processing standards and timelines. The main change they made is they're accepting applications electronically, but before they can finalize and issue an approval, they need to see the hard copies. Okay, so they're recognizing that it might be difficult to, you know, get an apostille done, to get a police clearance, you know, because government offices are closed, people can't work in their office, and so there would be some challenges in putting together a physical file. So allowing for minimum documents to allow for due diligence to take place, and specific timelines for hard copies to be provided are the main steps that they've taken to be able to continue with the processing efficiencies. And I think they're, you know, having spoken to all 5 of the heads of the unit, they're seeing, you know, if not an increase, maintenance of their levels coming in, because I think what's happened with this COVID-19 is it's been a reality check for a lot of people. You know, they maybe thought, oh yeah, I don't need this plan B, I'm fine, you know, and then suddenly, you know, everybody's been hit and they're realizing, geez, I wish I had done this in the past, so I had this extra option.
Okay. Do you expect any short-term stimulus incentives, which we have seen in the past, for example, with the hurricane relief funds? Is any chatter on that happening in the Caribbean?
Yeah, well, we've seen a few already. I mean, we've seen in St. Lucia, you know, they've amended their bond option, you know, bringing that in at a much lower price at $250,000 US for the bond option, and they've also reduced the investment levels under their donation option, the National Economic Fund. So they've been responsive to the situation by looking to attract more people by giving a different incentive. Antigua and Barbuda recently introduced their University of West Indies Fund, which is to target families of 6 or more. Grenada, Dominica, no major changes yet. In St. Kitts Nevis, they have an election there on June 5th, so nothing's obviously going to happen before the election, but I would expect that we'll see some type of package coming out of St. Kitts Nevis shortly thereafter, once we know, you know, who the government is going to be.
Very quickly on that point, if I come to Ron, any predictions on the elections in St. Kitts? Do we see Timothy Harris staying in office?
So from here on, you're saying?
You're breaking up a little.
Sorry, no, I was saying it depends who you speak to. You know, this is the nature of Caribbean elections. You know, if you speak to one party, they have a comfortable majority. You speak to the opposition, they think they have a comfortable majority. So one of the challenges, yeah, well, one of the challenges too is that very often St. Kitts citizens would fly in to vote and support their party, and with the travel restrictions, they're not going to be able to do that to the same level that we would have seen in previous elections. So that could be an interesting sidebar, you know, in terms of the results of the election, and possibly, you know, challenges about the validity of the election if they couldn't get all the nationals able to vote. So it's always interesting to watch and manage. So I'll be looking forward to seeing how that pans out over the coming weeks.
Keep us informed, Chris. Ron, I want to come to you because clearly, you know, we're moving into election mode in the United States. We know that President Trump a few weeks ago tweeted about, banning all outright immigration into the United States. And, the White House provided some clarity into, which sectors of immigration were affected or were not. EB5, the employment-based visa grouping, was left out of that. We're seeing now upwards of maybe 35 million Americans unemployed. How is this going to affect visas and green cards for investors? Clearly, there must be some effect on all of this.
There's quite a bit of effect. Hello, Bruno, and hello, everybody else. Actually, Bruno, there's three different but related phenomena that are affecting U.S. immigration right now. One is obviously the pandemic, but there's two other phenomena going on at the same time that are related to that, but in some ways different. The second thing is the economic decline and going from record low unemployment to record high unemployment. And that has had a huge impact on U.S. immigration policy. And the last thing, as you mentioned, is the election, which comes up in early November, and which is extremely tied to immigration. Many people think that President Trump got elected largely based on an anti-immigrant theme. At that time, it was Mexico and build the wall to prevent Mexicans from coming to the U.S. And now, especially since he can't run on the economy and he can't run on low unemployment, the default seems to be running on protecting the country from immigrants who have been the cause of A, our economic problems, and B, in some circles, the cause of the pandemic. So let's look at these all real quickly. The pandemic itself has created travel bans. So we have a travel ban. It first started with a travel ban from China. Then there was a travel ban from 26 countries in Europe. Just this week, there was a travel ban for people coming from Brazil. There's a shutdown, other than essential services, of the Mexican border. There's a shutdown of the Canadian border. And recently, most of these have been extended. So that obviously is directly related to the pandemic. The other thing directly related to COVID is closing U.S. consuls around the world. So you can't get an appointment to get a visa to the U.S. Consuls have, it was expected that consuls would reopen at least one by one starting in June. Most consuls now have canceled June appointments. Some have put them off till August. So we're waiting to see consul by consul, but July, August seems to be the earliest that people will be able to get appointments to get green cards to the US or visas to the US. The economic decline was the reason given for the executive order that you referred to, Bruno, that bans all green cards, bans all immigrants to the US. That was about 4 or 5 weeks ago. And the notable exception to that was EB5, because if you're saying that the basis for the executive order is because of unemployment, and therefore we don't want new people coming to the US to compete with US labor, it's hard to justify eliminating EB5, which is a job creation program based on investment. So they didn't eliminate it. It is up for extension. Almost everybody thinks the immigrant ban will be extended again. And there's a lot of debate about whether it will include EB5. At the same time as that's going on, we expect we're a week or two away from the next ban of what's called non-immigrants, or people coming on visas to the US. And there's a lot of debate and controversy as to what's going to be included in that. But various categories, we expect that professional worker visas called H-1Bs will be subject to bans or restrictions. Whether the E-2 visa, which is the investment visa that people who use CBI to Grenada or Turkey use, whether that will be subject to a ban is, I would say, unlikely, but it's not clear, because since the E-2 is based on treaties, it makes it a little bit more difficult. And also, since it's based on investing and creating jobs, it makes it more difficult to justify. The election itself has caused a number of things, including we expect between now and November, we're just going to see more and more restrictive policies coming down and more negative immigration tweets as part of distinguishing Trump from the opposition, which is viewed as more favorable to immigrants, and more blaming of immigrants for all of the problems. Interestingly, throughout this, and the last thing I'll mention at this point, is that we may be days or weeks away from the U.S. Immigration Service shutting down for the first time ever. And there's all sorts of theories on this one, but the people who have been put in charge of the Immigration Service are strongly anti-immigrant. And they're saying now they're running out of money. And it probably is a much longer discussion we're going to have now as to whether that's true or not. But we are perhaps a short time away, and it's been publicly threatened that all or most of the employees of the Immigration Service may be furloughed because of lack of money. Other than that, everything involving immigration in the U.S. is perfect right now.
It's amazing because that, with an economic recession and high unemployment, you get a lot of bankruptcies, of course, or Chapter 11 bankruptcies and so forth. And that is a gold mine for investors, isn't it? That can snap up businesses at knockdown bargain basement prices, right?
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point, Bruno, and that's a point I've been involved in a lot of discussions. So let's assume that the CBI E2 visa option remains available, as it well may. It may be one of the survivors. And what that, the E2 is based on either starting a business or buying at least 50% of a business in the US. And there's no doubt in my mind, it's unfortunate, but there's going to be fire sales of businesses. There are businesses that are going out of business. There are businesses that are thrilled now if someone is willing to buy them at bargain basement prices. So I think for E2 investors using CBI in Grenada or Turkey as the route to getting an E2 visa to the US, or for over 80 countries in the world that already have investment treaties with the US and looking to use E2, the good news is that there probably are more businesses available at better prices to be purchased and used as the E2 vehicles than ever before.
Fantastic. I want to bring Warren Zahra into this because Ron mentioned travel bans. There are also airline bankruptcies, shutdowns. Jennifer talks about being able to fly from Beijing to Shanghai. Some borders being open, some are closed. It is a little bit confusing, and by nature, the CBI industry is one where people do essentially travel a lot. You deal with clients who are high net worth individuals, but they have businesses in various jurisdictions, various countries. They may have been educated in one country. They're married with a citizen of another country. Their children are born in another country. Global citizens are highly mobile people, so they need to move around. What challenges, Warren, do you see going forward in the travel business? Specifically, people do need to get from A to B and also attend events and conferences. What's the discussion being had at perhaps the World Tourism Organization, those bodies, and how it affects our decision making?
Well, hello everyone, and good afternoon to you all. Being located in Malta gives us access perhaps to information at a high level. It's easier than in larger countries. So looking at what's happening in terms of the airline industry, which obviously is the transport methods most used for everyone to get around, one of the main effects that is going to be clear after we come out of COVID or the post-COVID era is going to be the impact on the airline industry per se. For example, in Europe, what we are seeing is airlines who have suffered immensely. The whole landscape of the European theatre, for example, is that a lot of the smaller airlines may not be around after these past few weeks, leaving perhaps a situation where you may have 6 to 7 very large airlines operating within the European continent, for example, and obviously beyond. So the landscape in terms of travel and choosing of destinations is going to be determined by the accessibility. Everything that I've seen over the years has pointed to locations becoming more popular because simply there was better access to those locations. Obviously, the main cities, London, New York, Paris, Frankfurt, Berlin, Rome, these are always connectivity is always good because it makes sense for the airlines to run those routes. Secondary and third-tier destinations, such as Southern Mediterranean, Malta included, might have a detrimental effect because the airlines may not look at that route as being essential in the post-COVID era. It might be that that route stops. So, for example, Barcelona to Malta might not be a lucrative route, so that actual schedule comes off the map. So your conference areas, the locations for conferences, are going to be very much impacted by the access of air.
Financial risks aside on this, if you have clients that want to organize events, we as a global non-profit body organize quite a few events throughout the year, often in different countries. We've done that in Athens, in Montenegro. We've done that successfully in Malta, most recently in Cyprus, in Geneva. Unfortunately, this year's event in Brussels had to be cancelled. How do you think contracting will be done in a post-COVID environment? Because I think there's a genuine concern that for people that want to organize conferences so clients can meet face-to-face, or clients and agents can meet face-to-face, will be asked to put down heavy deposits. But there is some concern around that. What's your perspective on this? And this is to get the industry lifted and kick-started again. We're going to need some reassurance. What are the hotels doing about this?
Okay, so this actually is something which is happening live at the this morning. I was in touch with my office and we received 2 or 3 inquiries, which were very, which is a positive thing at the moment, for conferences in 2021. And whilst I believe things will be ironed out, the key feature at the moment is that our clients who are inquiring are very simply looking for insurance and assurance that their money is safe. The industry, the tourism industry, as everybody knows, has been one of the most impacted worldwide. Obviously, the international brands, hotels are going to have their act in order, but the average conference organizer, the agency or the corporate events manager is asking, if I want to organize an event in Malta, for example, next June, can you give us the conditions on which we have to pay deposits? When do we pay the deposits? And more importantly, if there was a a situation where a recurrence of COVID or something similar had to occur, we want to guarantee that those monies will be refunded immediately with no issues. And
is that happening? Ryan? Is that happening? Hotels providing this reassurance?
To be honest with you, with the major brand hotels, we are discussing the conditions to. It's a two-way thing. The supplier needs to have some income coming in, whilst you have to give that peace of mind to the consumer. So the balance to me has been one where we try to extend the periods by when deposits need to be placed. But having said that, the hotel needs to be sure that that business is going to come. Now, what we have been suggesting is that escrow accounts can be used, where the agreement, the finance is there, the suppliers can clearly see that the finance is there, and the transaction can take place. Obviously, coming out of a 3-4 month period, probably we will lose the summer. The autumn period and early winter is always the lowest end of the season in Europe. So hotels and suppliers are going to be cash strapped. They need cash flow. But the clients don't want to really feel like they're placing deposits for companies to run their businesses today with their money. So,
yeah,
you know, this is so the bottom line is that the contracts are definitely going to have to be reviewed to give that comfort zone to the clients to place their deposits down.
all right. I like the way you talk about consumer protection, which is key to the travel and tourism industry. Of course, it's an area of business which has quite high barriers of entry in terms of quite large amounts of capital to invest in a hotel. On the opposite end of the spectrum, and Chris Willis, I want to bring you in on this, the citizenship by investment and residency planning industry actually, for the most part, doesn't have very high barriers to entry, right? I think we can all pretty much agree on that. What about value and consumer protection? What are your thoughts in that area?
Well, I think it's a key message that certainly the IMC can support in putting out to industry that when a client is looking to engage with a service provider, they need to do their own due diligence and make sure that it's a competent and ethical person who's going to be representing them. And so, promoting that message of having a properly qualified person will help to strengthen the integrity of the industry by making sure there is this consumer protection element. And we see this in other countries where there's regulation in place, whether it's through law societies or regulated consultants, for example, because it comes down to having some enforcement powers where within a certain jurisdiction, if representatives are regulated, then enforcement can be applied if they are not acting in a proper manner. The difficulty, certainly with the IMC being a global organization, is that you don't have those powers of enforcement. So you've got to then work with the local governments to be able to identify people who are maybe not working as ethically as they could be, for example. So it's really just to promote things such as the certificate of immigrant of investment migration that the IMC is putting out, making sure that as many people can join up as a member to show that they've already been through a vetting process. And those types of messages should be put out to industries to make sure that you shouldn't always be looking at what professional fees a service provider is offering you, but actually their competency to get you the end result that you're after. We often hear the expression, you might think a professional is expensive, but wait till you hire an amateur, right? And as we said, with the with these low barriers to entry, people are popping up, to a greater or lesser degree in different parts of the world, but it certainly is a challenge that I think as a body we have to try to eradicate.
Okay. We've had a question on a subject that we haven't generally heard about for quite a while, and I'm going to go to London for this. Brexit.
My second favourite subject.
Many of us like to go back to January and December. Well, December of last year, where we had a lot of Brexit talk, and then suddenly in sort of mid-February we stopped talking about it completely. We're hearing a little bit coming out of the Commission sometimes. The Commissioner for Michel Barnier, who's doing the negotiations on behalf of the Commission, and David Davis, who's heading the UK task force for exiting the European Union. How is all of this impacting, Nadine, UK immigration, and what is the status in respect of Brexit? I think that's sort of roundabout the question that was asked in the widget. So can you give us an update on this, please?
Of course. So as we all know, the UK formally left the EU on 31st of January this year, but there's currently a transition period which applies until the 31st of December this year. And during that transition period, freedom of movement will continue to apply. There is an option for the UK to apply for an extension of the transition period. They would have to make that application by the 1st of July. And all indication to date is that despite COVID, trade negotiations are continuing, and the current government has no intention of applying for the extension to the transition. So at the moment, we have to assume that transition will end on the 31st of December, at which point freedom of movement will end as well. And that means that all UK nationals travelling into the EU and all EU nationals travelling into the UK are subject to immigration control. So what this means as well is there is a new immigration system for the UK, which will come into effect on the 1st of January. It's actually not that new. It's exactly the same as the current system, but it will apply equally to EU and non-EU nationals. The key differences will be the removing of the Resin labour market test, which is actually very interesting because that was put in place at a time when we had record low unemployment. Post-COVID, unemployment figures are going to go up quite considerably, so question mark over whether that will be changed. They've also reduced the skill level, so now rather than degree level, it's A-level standard. Again, interesting development, particularly given that post freedom of movement, there is going to be no low skilled or low paid entry routes into the UK, which could have a pretty significant economic impact. And they've reduced the salary threshold overall, and then the costs to companies in particular are going to go up quite considerably as well. There is talk about introducing a route for those who are self-employed or highly skilled, so not through a traditional employment route. That's not likely, while there is support for that and it's gaining traction, it's not likely to happen in January next year. It's probably going to be phase 2 in 2022. And equally, one of the real positives that are coming out of Brexit and the new immigration system is the technology. So the technology that's been used to support the European settled status applications is actually very impressive. It's very efficient. You can make an application on your telephone, on an app. We're hoping that will be rolled out to the new system, but again, that won't happen until earliest 2022. According to the government, COVID is not going to impact the continuation of Brexit and the UK's leaving the EU and immigration, but practically speaking, it has slowed things down.
Okay, all right, Jennifer. I want to come to you on this point because what's your view on, and presuming you follow, of course, as an expert in global immigration, you follow all the developments that are taking place in the Caribbean, in the US, in London, to be able to service your client base. What's your view in terms of residence and citizenship options post COVID-19? What do you think can be really attractive for your clients? Any advice, words of advice for governments?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I have to echo with what Chris said. I think having a standard is very important. So I think IMC, should play a major part to assist the specifically the agents in China, I will have to say, because few markets that what I oversee, for example, Korea, for example, Taiwan, and then of course you all know about China is dominant by the immigration agents. Having an international standard, having them participate in this kind of a seminar or maybe in future would be very important. For first of all, is for the government to understand what are the program will be beneficial for the clients, and then of course, and also for all these agents to understand, because they actually receive a lot of clients, they have a lot of outlets in their own countries. I think they also have to understand each countries have their own due diligence policies to accept applications. I think those standards, I really think that is very essential in the market. This is one thing I want to echo first. I think for clients post COVID-19, a lot of clients will definitely still look for places as a plan B. Which is, I can give you some examples. For example, during the COVID-19.
On that thought, let's ask the audience what they think on this.
Okay.
Let's launch what those guys think. So that's your screen right now. We'll give everybody 5 seconds. So please get voting. We're going to close this off. So the question is, where will Chinese clients migrate post COVID-19? I'm going to close that and share the results on the screen. So any further thoughts, Jennifer?
Oh, it's interesting that they have 45% to Europe and 23% to Australia and New Zealand, which is I actually agree on that. There would be so, and then Asia, interesting, is 5%. So I think it's true that we see starting a lot of clients will start to think, where's my plan B, right? So there are a few different kinds of clients. For example, if they wanted to move to if they are the family basis in Asia, of course they want to move somewhere closer, specifically when there's a travel ban, for example, in Europe or to North America, specifically with the longer flying time. So probably they would think, oh, Asia would be a good options to them. With the current China-US tension, client would also think about Europe more. Because with the Europe, they actually, if they for example have a citizenship of Malta or Cyprus, or even have a golden visa like Portugal, they will allow them to be able to travel with the whole EU or Schengen, able to reside there permanently if they want to. So I think that gives them a lot of, I would say, a bigger capacity of the freedom of movement and then the establishment in Europe. And of course, New Zealand, Australia, even Canada, even though like the Canada-Cuba IP now is suspended until next year, however, still a lot of clients are asking Canada, because I think, first of all, this is very Asian, I would say not, well, I would say a lot of Asian clients, specifically Hong Kong, China, Koreans now, and they like to reside in Australia and Canada. So those countries are also on the list for the clients to look at. So I think after the post COVID-19, first of all, the client would definitely look at the places where they first to release a travel ban, the places where they have a very good health care system that would take care of their citizens and residents, and the places where they can stay for longer periods. The plan B is more for residing places. However, I will also think about, I would also comment about there are few there's a category of client they will still think about Caribbean, specifically with the current situation with being, I think, really proactive government that they have is online submission, maybe simplify the notarization, authentication of the documentation. Definitely helped a lot of clients to start planning, because Caribbean options is still, I would say, first they don't need the client to land. Yeah, so that you can and receive the citizenship beforehand, and you don't have to go there. And then the processing time is shorter. So they do have, I would say, a plan B that allow them to travel in case something happen. I could share with an example that a few clients of ours actually has been using the Caribbean passport, been traveling around the world since January. They have not been back to their own countries. So they've been traveling in Caribbean countries, 1 or 2 months of each countries, and then they've been traveling to, let's say, Portugal, Germany, and Italy, or when the virus starting to see more like serious, and they will move to another country. The whole reason behind is because they have this traveling passport, they have this travel access for them to go. So I think this would be also very interesting to see post COVID-19.
I'm just noticing, I'm going to share the results again on the screen, where you've got, the 5 options, and the bottom one, 18% of respondents put none of the above. So I'm just wondering, that's perhaps Caribbean. So I'm going to launch another poll and see. The question here we're asking is, do you think interest in CBI programs is the same? Everybody, give you 10 seconds to vote. Wow, everyone's really quick on the trigger on this poll, which is nice to see. All right, I'm going to close that off and share the results. Okay. Increased in 53%. I think that goes in some way to back up what you were saying, Jennifer. I'm conscious of the time. We always have really, really interesting guests on this program. We do need to wrap things up. So I'd ask each one of you if you can give us some final thoughts, what your perspective is going forward. And I'll go to Ron Klasko in New York first, please.
Well, I think going forward for the U.S., as we mentioned before, the election will be a big issue. You maybe never before, at least in my memory, do you have an election where immigration may become issue number one. Certainly the present administration doesn't want to run on its record of dealing with a pandemic. We have had more cases and more deaths, unfortunately, than any other country. So immigration is a diversion from that issue. We have the opposition party, the Democratic Party, which is former Vice President Biden, is considered very pro-immigration. Trump is considered very anti-immigration. So it's out there, which means that in 2021, we will have the beginning of a new 4-year anti-immigrant president in charge, in which case things will be difficult in the US, or we will have a new president who's very pro-immigration, having won an election on a pro-immigration agenda, in which case we may see a rebirth and an energizing of immigration to the US. So the next 5-6 months are really critical in the US, both in terms of how the pandemic plays out and how the election plays out.
And I want to thank you for these timely updates that you always provide to the IMC, and of course wish you and your fellow Americans the best of luck in the next few months for the upcoming election. And Nadine, some final thoughts from London?
I think for the UK and Europe, the recovery is going to be migration, mobility, freedom of movement are going to be really critical to the recovery and the speed of the recovery. I think what's going to be really critical going forward is discussions around travel bridges and travel bubbles in order to facilitate ongoing movement into Europe and into Europe as a whole, but also around Europe.
Thank you. In the Caribbean, Chris Willis, some final thoughts, please.
Thanks, Bruno. Yeah, I mean, the main message is that it's business as usual for the Caribbean program. So please keep, considering these as your options and submitting your files. I just wanted to make the comment too, we've seen a big increase in the need for quality healthcare as being a motivating factor for people, in terms of, if there is to be another type of pandemic, where can they go? Countries may only let you in if you're a citizen or a permanent resident. So having this second citizenship or residency status could allow you access into another jurisdiction to get quality healthcare. So that's following on from what Jennifer was saying, is a big factor we're hearing from many more people now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris. And Jennifer in Hong Kong, it's getting late evening for you. Some final thoughts?
Yeah, going forward, I think representing the people in our places, we hope the travel ban will be eased very soon for Europe and UK and the US. So a lot of our clients can start traveling and then start going on the regular mode. And then hopefully we will see more programs will be opening soon, so we can have more clients coming on board.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Warren, Zahra, global travel trade analyst and an expert. Some final thoughts from you, please.
I think once the airports and borders open, if we see an enthusiasm back for travel, airline connections coming back to relatively normality, let's say, and supply chain that understands the concerns of the purchasers. If we can get that security for people, both in terms of financial, of health and safety, then I think we have won a lot of the battle, and we'll see business back.
Thank you. From my perspective, I hope that taxi drivers have used this lockdown period to learn how to drive more safely the world over. And I'll be glad to get back into an Uber very shortly. Thank you very, very much for joining us. I hope you, the audience at home, have enjoyed and found today's session interesting. If you're not already a member of the IMC, then please visit the IMC handouts panel, which is on the right of your screen, for more information on joining us. If you are a member, go to the website. Lots of information being published on a daily basis with updates that are happening around the world. We'll be back tomorrow at 2:30 Central European Summer Time. And incidentally, I'll be chatting with Percival Cluden, who's the Chief Executive Officer for the Grenada Citizenship by Investment Unit, and also on the call will be Mohammed Asaria, who's the co-founder and managing director of Range Developments based in Dubai. So until then, once again, thank you very much, Ron, Nadine, Warren, Jennifer, and Christopher, for giving up some of your time today. I very much enjoyed this and look forward to seeing you all again very shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Introducing the Certification in Investment Migration from the Investment Migration Council, the first structured learning product of its kind globally, designed for you. Explore the bite-sized learning pathway of each module on our custom online platform. You can track your progress as you go and learn at a pace that suits you, with an estimated 5 hours of study time per module. The Certification in Investment Migration contributes to the development